Are you an armchair climate activist? Do you demand action on climate? You're marching for action on climate? You're desperate for more and more action on climate? I've heard so many people talk about want action on climate, action on sustainability, etc., etc. The question is, how much effort do they put in themselves in regards to this action on climate? Yes, you can build lots of windmills and you can put lots of solar panels on and you can do that. But how many solar panels would it stop to stop the rain in Sydney just now, for instance, reoccurring? There's no way to measure that. You can't measure the effects on CO2 solar, wind and lithium have for many generations. It's got to be many generations before they've completely eliminated the emission of CO2. It's just logical. Logically appraise what's going on in the world and how it is, and you can see you've got this target 2050, but even then you have to ask yourself what drastic measures are they making to make 2050 a target for carbon neutral when carbon neutral is not really explained what it means, so we can't say, okay, this is how we can then plan to get that target if we discuss what it meant. But where is the balance in that? Where is the balance to act on climate? You would act on the effects of climate. We know the climate's changing, but the climate change is, well, no one can say what it will. It might be this: rainier, wetter, drier, colder, wherever you are, because it fluctuates anyway, and the fluctuations may get greater, and there might be wild weather events, but nonetheless, people go and more or less adapt to that. The point is, it's about reducing CO2 in the most easiest way and recycling it. Why the world isn't talking about recycling CO2 and all the talk on climate change, it's the recycling of CO2, which obviously is the sustainable, organic, economic part of the climate change, political, financial, whatever jargon that it is. And it's a bit of a jumbo jet ride to wealth for people who are involved in promoting action on climate change, but don't do much at all about it, as we can see, because they do not talk when they go to talks on climate talks. Where's the talks about taking CO2 out of the air? Where's the talks about that? If you can't talk about taking CO2 out of the air and recycling it into the biomass, then you're missing the whole point of the discussion. There is no discussion, in other words. But if you discuss it from the beginning, openly, you'd come to a bit of a consensus, not on climate change, but what to do about it. There's never going to be a consensus on climate change. There can't be. But there will be a consensus on what to do about it, because you say, what are the effects of it? What the effects of it are, what are the causes, correlate into a means, a sustainable means of reducing the CO2 problem. Because if the CO2 is a problem, right, then you have to look at ways of taking that out of the air by increasing the biomass, and you do that by employing people in exactly that system. And this should be worldwide. It shouldn't be having wars at the moment in this world. There should be employing all those soldiers in the Green Army for the world. If they're concerned about the sustainability of life, they're certainly going about it in a very opposite way a sensible person would. So you see, when they say words and you look at them and say, well, and people are protesting who've never had a job and do not understand the history of wealth requires at some stage someone breaks eggs and you can't put them back together again. They started them all right up, they discovered power through steam, etc. ended up discovering all sorts of amazing and astonishing, now extremely scary things. But what they haven't discovered is how to speak openly and logically and in a practical sense what the average person can make sense of. And the other people who can read this thing can not go, hang on a minute, what does it actually mean? Because we can see another way of doing it and it might be better than that. And that is to increase the biomass, which then recycles the CO2. And by taking water out of the air and recycling town water and being very wise about that, like there's a lot of skill in that in the world, we can learn from other people. And that knowledge should become universal. And instead of spending money out on arms, the corporate system should be spending money on greening, employing as many people as it could, because a corporate system is responsible ultimately for the not humanity is just part of the corporate system right back to it always is part of a corporate system. Humanity shouldn't just spring on board and take advantage of a corporate system from wherever it's ruling. The hierarchy always takes advantage of everyone else. So there's no real symbiotic relationship, other than it's just an hierarchical one, and then you get your lower orders, and that's how it is, and it always seems to be how it will be. But there's no real acknowledgement that there are, if you're going to deal with CO2, then it's a problem of humanity, and it's a problem humanity must be involved in, you're just told to go along with without anyone explaining, well, there's got to be more to the story than windmills and solar panels when Australia's going to go shortage of food because of rain. And that is something because they haven't looked at the effects of climate change and grown food where there is more stable. You can actually absolutely control the conditions. In a drier area, they have an advantage in drier area if you can get water to it, you can grow good food there. Then where there's plentiful of water, but you can get all your food washed out if you can control the water. And this is where the whole talk about CO2 and reducing it, well, yes, reduce it, take it out of the air and recycle it into a green biomass and in organic food. And you've got universally a sustainable employment system, because you're doing this is to employ people and developing this because it's ongoing and it's perpetual. So you create these regional gardens all over anywhere people want to work on. And that takes CO2 out of the air, employs people who really need to work, and creates another system, not totally reliant on the chip and technology, because this is where you can't say we only want technology and we only want to be sustainable, blah, 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 and ignore the fact that human beings is self-sustaining. Human being is self-sustaining if they're given the opportunity. Those that want to, like the Amish do, many people do, the Amish do it very successfully. So there's no reason why other people can't decide to live post technology. Other people might go to a post-technological world and not all go into a total technological world, all those interface between the two, because in the end you have something that has then the variety humanity needs to see itself and to reflect upon itself and to know, they can have choices, and it's got choices. It knows there's a choice between one way or the other. And it's got that's a freedom in itself, knowing it has that choice. You can choose what you like, but that's knowing that you can leave your organisation. It's the basis of freedom of choice, really. And the free to vote your way in life is a freedom of choice. But if you take all the freedoms away, how you deal with climate change can't be talked about, because we don't understand why it's so limited in the discussion, when the discussion should be about CO2, and it should be about how to take that out of the air. Because then you can't measure the effect on climate change on CO2 by putting solar panels up, because you've got to take out, there's a time lag between the CO2 emitted in the factories and then this replacing that somehow with the energy it's got off the sun. So you can't actually measure that, but you can measure how much CO2 the biomass takes out. So that's actually something you can actually. So they actually is a profit there, a direct, absolute better profit for people and the planet to plant trees. You just do it the technologically way. That might make corporate profit, but there's no reason this can't make corporate profit either, because one complements the other, and it makes for a more easier way, less combative way to reach a goal that's beneficial for the corporate sector and for the people like the Hamish who want to live like they do, and maybe other humans may want to go and say we're going to a post-technological place where we organise it. We can still use technology, but we want to do the work by our hands if we can. And simple machinery is enough to sustain a living. If you want to live like that, you should have the choice, not just. And there is the room to do that, and it also serves the purpose of removing CO2 out the air, which is supposed to be the cause of climate change, and it recycles it into the means of defeating it. And it's much more. You can measure that. You can't measure solar panels. You can't measure how much CO2 you take out of the air with solar panels. I don't know how that offsets anything, because you have to make them and transport them, etc., etc., and then pay for them, etc., etc., which is all energy. It's all energy. So you plant a tree, it makes energy. So it's extremely positive. It doesn't drain energy, it makes energy. Therefore, it's a genuine capital gain, a bonus to the planet and everyone. And it's as simple as that.